Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, and it is very nice to be back once again after an absence of 2 years here in the capital area. I think the most important thing we need to do at the outset of a discussion on a subject as complex and complicated, truly as vast and voluminous as the record of tax-exempt foundations and philanthropy in this century in the United States is the necessity of limiting the subject to a manageable range or quantity. It's a very vast and voluminous subject because in recent years there have been about 21,000 tax-exempt foundations operating in this country, and of that number there have been at least 2,500 foundations in recent years making annual grants of over $5,000 each and reporting these grants to a central data collection service called the Foundation Center, which is a major source of information on the subject. So we're dealing with thousands or tens of thousands of foundations and many hundreds of thousands of grants they make every year. The literature from just a few of the major foundations in this country published in a year's time would require the back of your car to carry it away. It's a tremendous amount of data. So I should say immediately that I am not critical of the vast majority of tax-exempt foundations in this country, because I believe that overwhelmingly most of them over the years have a very praiseworthy record in promoting the various philanthropic, scientific, charitable, educational, cultural, civic, and other purposes for which they were established under federal tax law by their founders. And indeed, many of the criticisms that have been raised against the foundations in recent years are not subject matters which I'm concerned with really in my book or in the talk this evening, so we should get those out of the way. There have been 4 investigations by Congress of tax-exempt foundations in this century, first in 1915, then in 1952 to 1953, then a subsequent follow-up hearing in 1953 to 54, and finally a lengthy series of hearings in Congress during the 1960s, which resulted in the Tax Reform Act of 1969. During those hearings, some of the foundations, large and small, were criticized for sloppy accounting and reporting practices. Others were criticized for maintaining holdings in commercial ventures and enterprises, even though under tax law they were supposed to be non-profit organizations. And some of them were criticized for maintaining high or exorbitant public relations budgets. Others were found to be engaging in close transactions between the foundation itself and the people who created it to the benefit of those people. Also, some of the foundations were found to have their assets effectively remaining under grantor or family control. And during the 1960s, a number of the foundations were criticized for having apparently gone together and collectively influencing investment market patterns and activity in this country. Those are not my criticisms, and I should say that the only investigation which really approached some of my concerns was the investigation in the early 1950s. First of all, the Cox Committee investigation in Congress, and then the Reese Committee in the House of Representatives. These investigations did point out the fact that some of the most influential, powerful, and wealthy foundations, such as the Rockefeller and Carnegie Foundations and the then recently formed Ford Foundation, had been giving their money over the years, the tax-exempt earnings from their investments, to left-wing and pro-communist organizations, and to many individuals and groups that were advocating more government control. A good example of this pattern was the fact that from the early 1920s through the late 40s, an organization called the Institute of Pacific Relations received many hundreds of thousands of dollars for its activities from the Carnegie and Rockefeller Foundations. In the early 1950s, the IPR was shown by the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee to have functioned in this country substantially as an instrumentality of Soviet espionage and propaganda, primarily functioning for the purpose of orienting post-World War II American foreign policy in the direction of turning mainland China over to the communists. That was one of its major purposes. So that's a good example of the pattern that that investigation uncovered, and we'll have need to refer to it later in this evening. But that is not particularly exclusively my concern, just the funding of left-wing or pro-communist organizations and individuals by the foundations, because that is a very vast subject itself. I believe from my research I've been able to establish that some of these foundations, the most powerful ones and some of their smaller allies, have over the years consistently been involved in a truly conspiratorial strategy. And I believe it's very important whenever we use an emotionally charged concept like conspiracy that to avoid as much misunderstanding as possible at the outset, we should define that word carefully. And a conspiracy, it seems to me, throughout all of history, any example we examine, conspiracy has been a uniquely human activity. That's why I suppose we read so little about dogs and cats conspiring. It's a human activity, and it's necessary to distinguish this activity from all others on the basis of some common characteristics that are always present, and they comprise the definition. They are as follows. The individuals who are parties to a conspiracy, first, are advancing basically the same or common objectives. Secondly, they're advancing objectives which most of us would agree by very reasonable standards to be personally harmful, evil, or destructive. Third and finally, they're advancing these objectives without advertising fully in advance what they're planning to do, or we often say they're working deceptively or in secret. Now that's all that's essential to the idea. Some conspiracies in history have chosen optional means and mechanics, some issuing uniforms, others using membership cards. But those are clearly optional mechanics. They're not essential to the point. They're not basic to the concept. What I gave you in the definition is. And it's important to note one other principle. Please note this. This will help you understand many of the things we'll discuss this evening. And that is that the definition says that the parties to a conspiracy are advancing basically the same or common objectives. But please notice, not at all necessarily are they doing so for the same personal reasons and motivations. Now this is very important. I suppose the classic scenario would be a television drama about a fugitive from justice, escaping from the police. He doesn't want to go back to jail. Another person feels sorry for him, shelters him in their home, and in the eyes of the law at least, both parties we know are parties to the same criminal conspiracy to obstruct justice, but we know they're working for different motivations. Now that's a simple principle. Keep that in mind. It will clarify a number of the things we'll be covering. The particular conspiratorial strategy that I'm concerned with, and of which I believe the foundations have been a part, is something that has really been active around in the world for a number of generations, but it's something that was probably best perfected at the end of World War II by the international communist movement in the nation of Czechoslovakia, and it was later put in book form by the Czechoslovakian Communist Party historian Jan Kozak. The title of the textbook, translated into English, read, How Parliament Can Play a Revolutionary Part in the Transition to Socialism and the Role of the Popular Masses. Now this was translated into English and reprinted by a committee of Congress in 1962, and then later in book form. Basically, the strategy said that the conspirators who wished to rule a country, like the United States, would use their influence and infiltration at two levels. First, they would use positions of influence in the leadership of activist organizations at the grassroots level, working among the people, to exert pressure from below. Then they would use their influence, more frequently, in positions of power in the central government, to exert pressure from above, using the power of government most of the time to cause or worsen all kinds of social and economic problems in that country, so that once the problems are obvious, the citizens complain about them, then the conspirators leading the mobs in the streets and the conspirators in the government have the excuse to turn around and suggest solutions to the problems they've worsened, always solutions in the form of higher taxes, more laws, and increasingly dictatorial controls over every aspect of the people's lives. This is to be repeated sufficiently until one day the people wake up in that country finding themselves living in a police state. Since that strategy is so well identified for over 3 decades, has been used by the communists exclusively for conquering new territory since World War II, what I want to do is review a number of issues that you're familiar with in this part of the country as major problems today, show you why I'm convinced they're all part of this conspiratorial strategy to rule us, and how the big foundations are involved. Now, due to limitations of time, we are going to be concentrating primarily on just issues or examples relating to economic problems, property rights issues, and energy shortages this evening. We do not have time to go into many of the social problem examples, but I think to illustrate how this process works, we could take at least one example from the social problem category so we can see how this functions. And I believe in looking for an example there, I don't think we can find any more pressing or obvious social problem since at least the early 1960s than what is still today a rapidly rising, accelerating epidemic rate of violent crime and lawlessness around the nation. The crime rate exceeded a nationwide increase of 60% in the last decade, and it's going up still in all major categories. It's significant that we've seen a number of solutions coming from various sectors. In my book, The ACLU on Trial, I had reason to mention the fact that in 1967, the American Civil Liberties Union, which had been funded at that time and is funded today by the Ford, Rockefeller, and Carnegie Foundations, the ACLU had been a major lobbyist in Congress for the passage of something called the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act. And one of the things this legislation, which the ACLU and the Ford Foundation promoted, one of the things that this established was a new Justice Department agency in Washington called the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration. LEAA was supposed to help local police departments around the country meet the crime problem, but they've done some other most curious things. Here's an example. This is from the Associated Press, the San Antonio Register, September 16, 1978. It tells us that in 1978, in Northern California, Monterey County, a state jail facility was built, and LEAA provided half of the $4.5 million to build this jail. It was similar to jails that were federally funded in Arizona, Pennsylvania, Mississippi, Texas, Illinois, and Florida. Now, because LEAA provided half the money, the article tells us that the jail had to be built to meet, quote, LEAA guidelines calling for advanced, humane prison architecture, unquote. Well, now, of course, I didn't know what those words meant, ladies and gentlemen, until I read the rest of the article. We read on to discover, quote, since its completion 7 months ago, there have been 10 escapes from the jail, mostly by inmates who melted the jail's plastic windows, unquote. Now, I know it's hard to believe, but there it is from the Associated Press, indicating that one of the things LEAA does is build jails around the country with plastic window construction from which the criminals find it enormously easy to escape. We've noticed, though, something else. In 1970, the Ford Foundation, with a $30 million grant over a period of years, established something that exists today called the Police Foundation. And we read about the Police Foundation in this Ford Foundation publication. The primary purpose of the Police Foundation was to support and encourage the expansion of this concept of federal assistance to local police forces to meet the crime problem. So we saw from 1968 onward, LEAA was giving federal funds to local police departments around the country so they could acquire new personnel, new training, buy new equipment and facilities. But at the same time, just as had been the case with federal funding from what until recently was called HEW going to our local public school systems, when the federal aid came to the police departments, federal control followed. And the LEAA was trying very desperately to take administrative control over local police departments around the country. Members of the John Birch Society were concerned about this and opposing it from the beginning because we noticed how much this resembled the program that Adolf Hitler and all other dictators have required to control their people, namely removing local control of police, local autonomy over their activities, and replacing it with a centralized national police force structure. And so we were opposing this. We set up committees around the country. You remember the bumper stickers, support your local police and keep them independent? That was our primary concern. We almost had the issue to ourselves during those years. Well, I want to tell you that we're very pleased with the progress we've made, because this Ford Foundation finance project that became a federal agency, visibly worsening the crime problem and trying to impose a solution not only of a national police force structure, but also proposing very stiff federal gun control laws and other totalitarian requirements. This federal program, through our exposure and opposition, largely, substantially, due to what we were doing, became so discredited in the eyes of the public and much of the establishment that had promoted it by early 1980, and of course due to their own activities. They were so discredited early this year that when the House Budget Committee decided in March to do some cosmetic pre-election budget cutting, they found LEAA, as a result of what we'd done, enormously ripe for abolition. And on March 21st of this year, an objective of the John Birch Society for over 10 years was accomplished when the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration was formally abolished. Did you hear me correctly? Okay. Now, I'm sure that this is a surprise to some of you. I didn't want that to be too startling or upsetting, because I know that some of you never expected to come to a Birch speech and hear any good news. But if you bear with me later on, I will have some more good news for you, because a lot of other wonderful and encouraging things have been happening. But I think that once we understand that example, we could move into our major category of concern, and I think in this area we could sum up all of the examples as the federal government's long-term, intensive, and determined effort to destroy the American economy. In a nation like the United States, for the central government to cause long-term economic problems that affect everybody, they have to have a means or mechanism for doing so. Usually in the form of a central bank, the government must be able to control the amount of money and credit in circulation in the nation's economy, which means the amount of money and credit in the banking system. Unfortunately, we've had such a structure since 1913, when the Congress established the Federal Reserve System. Since that time, the Federal Reserve has functioned as a government monopoly corporation, controlling the amount of money and credit in circulation in the nation's banks, including the credit available for loans through your member banks in this area. As of March of this year, through legislation in Congress that had been originally sponsored by Senator Proxmire of Wisconsin, the Federal Reserve extended its monopolistic control over all banks and other depository institutions in this country. So now their monopolistic system is much more complete. But in recent years, despite many banks dropping out of this system, the Fed was controlling the amount of credit available for loans through banks and on a weekly basis increasing this. Now, in response to that policy, we had two choices we could make. We could go out and borrow some of the credit, purchase something we wanted, or we could have been more responsible, fearing that we were already overextended or might not have a job next year. We might have resisted this temptation to borrow further. If you have done that, ladies and gentlemen, in recent months, don't worry about it, because indeed the federal government's doing that for you also. Through a process called deficit spending, the Congress simultaneously takes large, massive, multi-billion-dollar chunks of the federally created credit from the nation's banks and then re-injects this back into the economy in the form of millions and millions of checks written on all kinds of social welfare income redistribution programs. Now, you should know, in recent years, the Congress has been borrowing over 70% of all the available credit market reserves in this country, which means that the remaining amount of credit from the banks will go to you and to your business at a very high rate of interest. Please keep that in mind, ladies and gentlemen, the next time Jimmy Carter is trying to blame you for the problem and take away your Visa card. What happens is the government has created the credit, injected it into the economy, always at a rate faster than they're simultaneously being produced the new goods and services we buy. So just like in a small-scale auction example we could easily recreate in the room this evening, the price on all of the less rapidly increasing supply of goods and services, all those prices must rise to absorb the new purchasing power bidding against them. The dictionary calls the consequence of this inflation. Now notice I'm blaming the government for the process. You may wonder about this, whether I'm correct, because you've heard Jimmy Carter blaming farmers, housewives, labor unions, and businessmen for inflation. So you may wonder, on what good authority do I have to make this statement? Well, the first authority is the Los Angeles Times, January 9th, 1977, an article by Robert Rosenblatt that told us that in early '77, a committee of the Congress, part of this process, the House Banking Committee, published a report in which they said that the same two-step process I described for you was responsible for causing, quote, more than 70% of the rise in the cost of living between 1966 and 1975, unquote. Notice they're part of the process, they admit it, they continue to do so. Another source of interesting authority is the Ford Foundation. Their Vice President, Roger Kennedy, I think you know the Ford Foundation is the nation's largest tax-exempt foundation, over $2 billion in assets presently, and earning tremendous amounts of money yearly on those assets, spending them for the purposes we'll be describing. The Ford Foundation Vice President Roger Kennedy, in this 1974 article in the Atlantic magazine, said, quote, "The government printed money to pay its debt, and the economy continued to overheat. Inflation increased. Inflation became a tax levied upon those who saved." In fact, he refers to inflation as, quote, "the same mode of surreptitious taxation," unquote. Now, this is fascinating to me, because studying the Ford Foundation, here on the one hand, their vice president says that deficit spending and government increasing the money supply causes inflation, and yet every Ford Foundation financed economic policy study that I could find recommended simply much more of the same. Now, we know the consequences of this policy. We've been experiencing it very severely. It was summed up in this article in the Associated Press, Santa Ana Register, Christmas Day of last year. It told us what we already know. Quote, "The average income of American families rose from $9,227 in 1969 to an estimated $18,467 this past year. But after adjusting for inflation and federal taxes, after-tax income in terms of the value of dollars 10 years ago fell from $7,947 to an estimated $7,800, unquote. That's the stagnancy, loss in real purchasing power that we've all experienced. The tax burden is equally severe and obvious. Today, all of us are paying somewhere in the neighborhood of 43 to 45 cents of every dollar we earn in some form of taxation. Not just the obvious taxes we know we pay, but so much of the taxation that is built into the manufacture, production, distribution, and sale of goods and services that we purchase, such as the 100 taxes or so that are built into the manufacture and sale of a loaf of bread by the time it gets to the store, or the 200 taxes that are built into this suit of clothes. All of this multi-layer, many-faceted taxation is only partially servicing the federal government's long-term debt liabilities now existing and extending into the future, which currently approach $9 trillion or $9,000 billion. We have today more citizens in this country who are partially or totally dependent upon the federal government for their livelihood on the dole than do we have people in the private sector producing the income and paying the taxes. I am encouraged that people in major segments of industry who are being hardest hit, notably the construction, real estate, and home building industries, these people are beginning to recognize exactly what's going on. This is from the Associated Press in the Los Angeles Times, April 20th of this year, very recently, and it quoted the National Association of Home Builders President Merrill Butler saying that these government policies, quote, are bent on the destruction of the American home building industry, and they are attempting to socialize housing as a solution, unquote. It's encouraging that they recognize the pattern. Now, we could spend literally weeks cataloging examples of deliberate, calculated, government-created wasteful spending. There's so many of them, only a couple of them I think would suffice to illustrate what I'm talking about. This is the Associated Press, San and Register, April 23rd, 1980. It tells us something reported by the General Services Administration, itself a bastion of graft and corruption. The GSA reported that the Federal Labor Relations Authority had been renting rooms in a Holiday Inn for their business, for their operations, a Holiday Inn in New York City at a cost of $9,000 per month. The total bill over a period of months exceeded $500,000. The interesting thing is, the GSA reported that the Federal Labor Relations Authority had a vacant federal office building fully available for their use only 3 blocks away. A more interesting example is this article 2 years ago, San and Register, Associated Press, October 28, 1978. It tells us that the General Accounting Office, which is supposed to oversee federal agency spending, put some interesting names in the payroll computer at the cabinet-level Department of Housing and Urban Development. Here's what happened. Donald Duck and 29 of his cartoon colleagues recently slipped onto the federal payroll, and Donald's salary, $99,000, sure wasn't Mickey Mouse, unquote. There you have it. That's the way the money is being spent. Department of HUD wrote a cashable payroll check to Donald Duck for $99,000. Well, most of this money, though, from the federal agencies is not coming directly to the grassroots level, directly to individuals or businesses. It's coming through a different routing procedure or process. And this is a process that the foundations have promoted over the years. We need to understand it fully before we can understand very accurately, very comprehensively how it can be defeated. The process is called regionalism or regional government. And it's something that was promoted over the years by, among other groups, the National Municipal League, which received $175,000 from the Ford Foundation for this purpose up through 1961. In a Ford Foundation publication on the subject, the League's president, William Casella, is quoted as saying, "Something isn't sacred just because it's in the Constitution. Often it's just the product of special interest pressures, but we've put a halo around it, and people are afraid to remove it. American citizens prefer to have government restricted, except on things they want." Notice, usually it takes a crisis to gain revision, unquote. Mr. Casella seems to understand how this strategy works. Now, we should take an example of regionalism that applies to every community in New York State, every local government around the country, and it will illustrate what's going on. If you understand this, you'll be able to recognize all the other examples you're dealing with and how they can be defeated. This is something we first read about in the Los Angeles Times, December 27, 1977. In this article, we were told that the Environmental Protection Agency, ladies and gentlemen, is once again absolutely determined to protect us. It told us that the EPA is determined that not a single trace element chemical or microorganism that has been shown to cause breast cancer in Canadian mice soaked in the substance for 6 months, not a single such substance will get into your local community water supply, and the EPA is so determined you'll be protected that they're ordering your community, all local governments that have a water system, to install in what is left of this 5-year period very expensive water treatment facilities. The EPA estimates the nationwide cost for installation of the equipment upwards of $685 million. They estimate the nationwide maintenance cost upwards of $92 million, and they say that it would increase your water bill in the Albany-Schenectady area about $100 a year. Now, what does this amount to? Here's a federal agency in the executive branch, the EPA, one of many, coming to your local government, county or city government, and they say, we want you to install the water treatment facility. And if you don't do that, we're going to cut off your existing federal funding for your school system, for your special education programs, for your road system, for your sewage treatment plant, or whatever revenue-sharing, federally funded project is already underway here, has already increased your local costs, and for which you're already dependent upon federal funding. So your local government, conservative or liberal, they may say, well, we can't afford to lose the money we're receiving, and if we don't take the money in this new project, it'll just go down the road to the next town. Very, very tempting, very difficult to resist this pressure. But they may say, well, we don't have this money in our budget, we can't afford it. That's the answer. The federal agency will always say that through more revenue sharing, matching funds, or block grant programs, the federal government will put up 80 or 90% or more of the cost over a 5 to 10 year contract period. All you have to raise locally is just 10 or 20%. It sounds much more affordable. So your local government signs the contract, receives the money. Then two things always happen. Because the government is causing inflation, the way we mentioned earlier, during the contract period, the originally allocated federal costs soon prove totally inadequate to cover your increased local government costs arising from the program. And if your local administrators ever fail to carry out the program exactly as the feds mandate, they will withdraw your funds. Then you will have new facilities to pay for, new personnel on your local government payroll, and no money in the budget to cover it. Now let me ask you a question. What do you do in New York State at the state level or the county or city level? What can you do when a number of federal agency programs increase the cost of state or local government beyond your ability to pay for it? There's only one thing you can do. What we did in my state of California, raise your local property taxes or raise your state taxes. That's all you can do. And this is the story of Proposition 13. Prior to Proposition 13, 50% of our state budget expenditures in California and 50% of my county's expenditures in Orange County were federally mandated program costs over which we had no control during the funding period after the contract was signed. Now this is important. So remember what would happen. Suppose you were able in New York State to do what we did, put a ceiling on these local tax increases. If you were able to limit the ability of state or local government here to increase its tax base, and then these federal agencies continued to impose increased costs on you at either level, what would happen? Well, you would end up in the position of New York City, or Cleveland, or Chicago, or Detroit, formally bankrupted by these federal programs, and then they would come in and bail you out, of course, but they would take total control over the administration of your local government structure. That's the way the process works, something the Ford Foundation largely conceived through its support of groups pushing in this direction. Now, before we see further foundation inspiration behind programs like this and behind the EPA, let's examine what the EPA is doing also in recent months. This was the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, June 14th last year. It told us that the EPA was sending agents around the country who were standing within 100 yards or so of gas stations with binoculars. They were spying on motorists filling their gas tanks. And if the EPA spies noticed that anybody was placing leaded gasoline into a new car, the owner of the station was subject to a fine up to $10,000 per violation. I was amazed at this. Here for the first time was an incident of government spying on U.S. citizens, and it didn't even involve the CIA. Well, my concern about this was perhaps a little premature because the ultimate example came along this year. This is an article from the Wall Street Journal, March 26, 1980. It tells us that Dow Chemical Company is now suing the Environmental Protection Agency because, quote, for about 9 years, Dow charged, the EPA on at least 50 to 60 occasions employed the Air Force and the Marine Corps for so-called remote searches of corporate facilities in the United States. Dow said the data collected from the searches were used later in various proceedings against U.S. businesses. And the EPA admitted the spying. Quote, in Washington, an EPA spokesman confirmed that the agency conducts flights using borrowed military aircraft. We fly over companies all over America, he said. This is an overflight program to detect pollution in waterways and in the air, unquote. When I was in Providence, Rhode Island yesterday, There was an article in their paper about the fact the EPA was planning similar surveillance flights over property owned by the citizens of Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Well, it's amazing to see this. I think, though, that some of this activity has been temporarily replaced by the EPA's #1 concern at the moment, Mount St. Helens. Ladies and gentlemen, this is an article from the Washington Post. I saw this about a week and a half ago. The date is May 22nd. And the article tells us, quote, "The monstrous black clouds that have been belching from the blasted north face of the volcano since Sunday are full of just the things the EPA and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission are trying to control: radioactive gases, sulfur dioxide, tiny dust particles, and other smelly pollutants," unquote. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you can understand that at this early a date, the Washington Post on May 22nd was understandably unable to report exactly what action the EPA plans to take against the mountain. Now, we should examine the cabinet-level Department of Energy. This was created in 1977 in the Carter administration. Its initial budget was $10.6 billion. Originally, they had 19,767 employees. That's now pushing $15 billion a year with 22,000 bureaucrats. What has the Department of Energy accomplished? Well, they haven't produced a single ounce of usable energy resource. They've had a yearly budget every year of their existence that exceeded the profits of the top 20 oil companies in this country. But they have accomplished something. It's called creating energy shortages. Now, you should understand how this works, how we could have known about it in advance. When the government causes inflation, the way we mentioned earlier, the government, to solve the problem, never suggests removing the causes of inflation, reducing the money supply, or stopping deficit spending. The government always says, well, we've got to have government controls on inflation, wage and price controls, and price controls of an increasingly less voluntary nature always have a predictable result. When the government, through price controls, makes it illegal for a businessman or a farmer to pass on his increasing cost to his customers, what is the only thing he can do? There are only two alternatives. One is called suicide, and the other alternative is called stopping the production of some of the less profitable goods and services he was producing earlier, which will result, amazingly, in an absence of some of those things that are no longer being produced. It's remarkable. And this is how the government causes shortages, other means, but primarily price controls. And you may be wondering, when I'm saying that the Department of Energy, all the agencies that it absorbed when it was created, that they've caused these shortages, you may wonder if that's just my personal opinion. No, ladies and gentlemen, it's a matter of federal court record. This is the Los Angeles Times, September 22nd, last year. It tells us that in a case brought unsuccessfully by the International Association of Machinists against the OPEC nations, U.S. District Court Judge Andrew Houck ruled that all of the energy shortages in terms of temporary availability of supplies of resources, including the long gasoline lines that we saw last year, all of these were caused by the price controls, the wholesale rationing or allocation policies, and the other regulations of the agencies built into the Department of Energy. Now, a lot of people wondered, is the Department of Energy still honestly trying to solve these problems, to clear up the shortages? Maybe they just haven't been successful in doing so. Well, we thought that until the Department of Energy told us otherwise. In their first year of operation with the $10.6 billion budget, they did manage to do something. They produced an energy emergency planning guide, which we first read about in this Associated Press story in the San Antonio Register, November 24th, 1978. Please notice this. This is most illustrative of what I'm talking about. Here's a section from that guide. Quote, "The draft of the planning guide also notes that the Energy Department plans to stage fake energy emergencies around the country during the next 3 years as a drill to gauge state and federal preparedness. Throughout the exercises, no participant will have advanced knowledge of the details of the scenarios or of the mock emergencies to be used, the draft report says," unquote. Now, how could anything be more obvious? Here's the department publishing a report in which they say they're going to use their power to cause these shortages, or fake energy emergencies as they call them, because they have solutions in mind they wish to impose. Well, ladies and gentlemen, one of those solutions we experienced last year. And by the way, it seems like we may be experiencing it right now. It's called the Emergency Building Temperature Restrictions. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to say this to you. I haven't met all of you, but you understand that in a room like this, when we have a lot of people present, I'm very pleased that you're all here, it does tend to raise the temperature of the room. And I want to say this to you because I don't know all of you personally. particularly the gentlemen in the audience, you have my full permission to remove your jackets at any point, because I don't want any of you falling asleep during the next 3.5 hours of this talk, okay? Seriously. The emergency building temperature restrictions, please notice, these were imposed by the Department of Energy on all public accommodations, all public buildings, and many private businesses around the country. This is a compliance manual the department sent to businesses. You saw the compliance stickers on businesses in restaurants and hotels. Well, a lot of us wondered, how could the Department of Energy justify coming into private property, into a business, and controlling the use of the energy resources rationed indirectly to them by the state? Or how could the government justify controlling private property, namely the use of thermostats in buildings? Seemed to be the sort of power that Adolf Hitler had in Germany. How could they do it? Well, it's interesting that one excuse the Carter administration had for doing this was a revenue-sharing program, the sending of federal funds through state and local agencies around the country to subsidize the heating bills of poor people in cold parts of the country, like this area. And also, federal funds were sent through state and local agencies to insulate homes and businesses. This resulted in the initial thermostat inspections in private homes in Buffalo, New York in the last 2 winters. A terrible invasion of private property rights and in violation of the Fourth Amendment. Well, a lot of people said, okay, if you're in California paying taxes, and those taxes are going indirectly through the government into someone's home in New York State to pay the heating bill or to insulate the home, then I can see you've got to come in to make sure the money's being spent. Because this sounds like a humanitarian effort on the part of the government to help poor people in cold parts of the country. We all thought that, at least until we saw this article from the Associated Press, the San Antonio Register, January 10th this year. It tells us that the Supplemental Security Income Administration was sending these thousands and thousands of checks out to people to pay their heating bills, checks at $250 each. The trouble is, the checks were going to people, quote, who live in foster care homes or certain nursing homes and do not pay separate fuel bills whatsoever, unquote. So once again, the program had nothing to do with helping poor people, apparently, but it did give the government the excuse for getting a foot in the door. And according to the Associated Press and the San Antonio Register, August 3rd of last year, 8,000 inspectors from the Department of Energy were allocated for such inspections in New York State alone. Now, what is the ultimate plan? Well, notice this. To show you this has nothing to do with shortages, have you been hearing recently from the government, from the media, that we have, at the present time, a glut of energy availability? We have plenty of an enormously plentiful supply, a surplus of gasoline, of heating oil, of natural gas, and that's why the prices have been coming down. Well, the government admits this. There is no shortage at the present time. Even crippled as it is, the free enterprise system, when some price controls are removed, can recover. Well, it's interesting that the government admits there is no shortage, and yet they want the controls. The Honolulu Advertiser, this UPI story, April 16th, told us that the Department of Energy wants the thermostat controls maintained, even though there's no reason for them. Deputy Director of Energy John Sawhill said, quote, regardless of whether an emergency exists, we think we need these regulations, unquote. So it has nothing to do with shortages. President Carter has ordered that they remain in effect through January 15th. Now, the ultimate plan of the Department of Energy is something called retail gasoline rationing. Fortunately, President Carter does not have independent authority to implement this, or the nation may well have already been shut down. This is a publication from the department telling us that if the gas rationing scheme goes into effect, all of us in this country will be limited to 45 gallons of gas per car per month. And those of you who have not suffered with the new math in the government schools immediately know that that translates directly into 1.5 gallons a day. Now, I don't know how you could function in the capital area of New York State on 1.5 gallons a day with your wheels, but I know that it would shut us down where I live in Southern California. Where are these programs and policies coming from responsible for EPA land use control and Department of Energy devastation of the economy? Well, they're coming once again from the same tax-exempt foundations. A good example is this report. In 1940, some of the powerful members of the Rockefeller family formed one of their smaller tax-exempt foundations called the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. And in 1977, the fund gave a $40,000 grant to the leaders of the various ecologite and environmental control groups around the country, which these foundations, Ford and Rockefeller, had been funding all the way back to the early 1950s. Well, the purpose of this grant was for the preparation of this report. It's called The Unfinished Agenda, the Citizens' Policy Guide to Environmental Issues. Now, those of you who are familiar with the various environmental control groups All of them are represented in this report. The ones that advocated the creation and strengthening of the EPA, the ones that formed the nucleus and the strength of the anti-nuclear movement in this country, and the ones that have been pushing for EPA land use control over every square inch of property in this country, their proposals are incorporated in this report. And if you're familiar with the EPA land use power grabs, this will sound familiar to you. The report proposes that the federal government should, quote, protect lands adjacent to parks, historic landscapes and sites, small towns and rural areas, and encourage careful urban restoration rather than the usual practice of demolition followed by skyscraper construction. Strengthen coastal zone protection to include all barrier islands, marshes, estuaries, and shorelands. Provide for careful federal and state standards for management of the nation's privately owned forests based on ecological principles of forestry. Preserve prime agricultural lands for farming purposes only, and provide extremely careful management of marginal agricultural lands to prevent erosion, fertilizer runoff, and spreading of pesticide residues. All of this recommendation for government monopoly control over land is based on what the report calls a new land ethic, and here it is. All ethics rest upon a single premise, that the individual is a member of a community of interdependent parts. His instincts prompt him to compete for his place in the community, but his ethics prompt him also to cooperate, perhaps in order that there may be a place to compete for. The land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, waters, plants, and animals, or collectively the land, unquote. Now, we should examine immediately the record of the largest foundation in this area, and that's, of course, the Ford Foundation. We're urged to do so. Its former president, McGeorge Bundy, the national security advisor to President Kennedy, asked us to do so. In a publication, he said, quote, the responsibility of the Ford Foundation extends back from mere explanation into a duty to examine how far any particular program may contain within it seeds for misunderstanding, unquote. Well, let's follow his advice and examine one of these programs. This program is the Ford Foundation's Division on Resources and Environment. Headed by Gordon Harrison, it has funded all of the anti-nuclear groups. It has funded all of the ecology and environmental control groups in this country. Some of them, like Resources for the Future, funded almost exclusively by the Ford Foundation since 1953. Gordon Harrison says this about federal land use control. In some important respects, the most ill-managed of all our natural resources has been living space. Until recently, development of land has been left almost entirely to individual choice, as though community had no physical reality deserving communal concern. The democratic principle that one man's liberty ends where another's begins has never been applied to constraints on the use of land, except when gross nuisances have been redressed at law, and even that remedy has been left ill-defined. Zoning, until a few years ago, has been the only systematic device to control land use with any general acceptance. And he goes on to say, America's failure to discipline the private exploitation of land to social needs results partly from the normal conservatism of institutions, partly from the shortage of planners and leaders who understand what is at stake and what alternatives are feasible, and partly from a shortage of instruments to control land use in harmony with our traditions, or prejudices, if you will, unquote. Now, I want to give you a textbook, perfect example of the Ford Foundation publishing one report in which they admit that government controls, the ones they've recommended all along, have caused our problems, such as energy shortages, and then another simultaneous Ford Foundation study which recommended the solution of total government control over the economy. Here's the first example. In 1974, the Ford Foundation funded an economic policy study by University of Maine economist Thomas Duquesneau. In this report, believe it or not, the Ford Foundation researcher admitted that government price controls and import quotas, which the Ford studies had previously recommended, had caused all recent oil shortages, resulting in U.S. dependence upon foreign oil sources. Now notice, here's one Ford study that admits government causes the energy shortage problem. There is another study of greater importance. In 1972, the Ford Foundation established something called the Energy Policy Project with a $4 million grant. It lasted 2 years, and its project director, David Freeman, published this report as the summary of the project in 1974. It's called A Time to Choose America's Energy Future. This is very important and relevant to what we've been talking about, because David Freeman went on to become a primary staff architect for the design of the policies in Carter's Department of Energy, more responsible for them than any other person. And David Freeman has become, because Carter thought so much of him, a commissioner in the Tennessee Valley Authority. What are some of the proposals in this Ford Foundation solution study of energy? Well, Freeman suggests, quote, a more positive governmental role. This role could range from more stringent implementation of existing regulations and programs to nationalization of certain activities, unquote. Freeman says that in the future, quote, nationalization is an option that may loom larger and seem more attractive, unquote. Keeping with the groups that the Ford Foundation has been funding, Freeman suggests, quote, no nuclear plants beyond those presently operating or under construction, unquote. And notice, in 1974, he was proposing the excuse for federal thermostat control. Financing arrangements to permit lower-income families to install insulation, storm windows, and weather stripping in existing houses. A system of energy stamps, emergency grants, or special allocations of fuel to low-income consumers who demonstrate potential hardship, unquote. And the Ford Foundation has gone further. Their newsletter of February 1st this year says that they've just given Cleveland State University $149,700 to do a new study to determine how best that these emergency fuel allocation grants can reach more citizens. Now, this is not the first time we've heard this kind of advocacy from the Ford Foundation. Let's take an earlier example to indicate the consistency. The Ford Foundation's National Affairs Division Director, Mitchell Sverdov, wrote in 1969, therefore, the times do not call for shrinkage of the responsibilities or powers of the government. After all, a neighborhood cannot accumulate or allocate central resources. Only a central government can. The neighborhood cannot by itself support a complex social service system. Only a central government can. The world is too complex for an abatement of government powers. If anything, the role of government must be strengthened, if for no other reason than that all of the programs depend on a pervasive and even coercive taxing system. In fact, we will find that effective decentralization and participation depend on having a high degree of central authority in the government decision-making process. Now notice, that was 1969. 2 years later, in 1971, Sverdov wrote of his understanding of how the foundations and government officials work together. Please notice this process. Our third main goal, strengthening the capacity of government, is really defined by the first two, since the problems of poverty, minorities, and environmental protection are so vast that they require large-scale public intervention, no matter how great the contribution from private sources. Although foundations have a tendency, especially since the hot Washington summer of 1969, to regard the federal government with a good deal of caution, the fact is that the Ford Foundation and many others collaborate closely with government, especially in Washington. Very often, federal agencies look to foundations to break new ground before the government is willing to embark on a collaborative effort, unquote. So he seems very clearly to understand how this process works. In recent years, people have wondered, why have the Ford, Rockefeller, and Carnegie foundations, in addition to promoting groups and policies that strengthen the executive branch of the federal government here, why have they promoted organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations, like the Trilateral Commission, which have international power objectives? Many of you know, I'm pleased to say, that the Trilateral Commission was established in 1972 by that great commoner and man of the people, David Rockefeller, for the purpose of promoting goals that he had in mind. And among the original members, the original American members, were President Carter, Walter Mondale, most of Carter's top-level cabinet appointments in the administration. The executive director of the group originally was our national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and presidential candidates Bush and Anderson have belonged. A very influential organization. And it's interesting that we discovered later some of their policies by going back and reading their obscure and very dry academic writings. One of these was something called the Report on the Governability of Democracies to the Trilateral Commission. It was published in 1973, very obscure at that time. It's been reprinted as The Crisis of Democracy by New York University Press in 1975. Get yourself a copy of it if you find this understandably hard to believe. This project, this report, was overseen by Brzezinski and co-authored by a State Department advisor to President Carter, Samuel Huntington. In the report, we're told that they've just discovered that all of us in this country are found to be in possession of a newly identified social disease. Now, you understand that until reading this, I didn't know about that. They have 2 chapters with the title of this new disease they've identified, and it's called Democratic Distemper. I didn't know what that was. In the chapters, they tell us that democratic distemper amounts to our traditional American obsession with our civil liberties and personal freedoms. They say that Americans are so concerned about their civil rights that this is causing a problem. It's preventing their goal of a world order and stability system, an international economic system, or what they call a new world order. They say Americans must be willing to accept some limitations on their personal freedoms if we are to have world order and stability. In fact, on pages 181 and 182 of this report, amazingly, the Trilateral Commission recommends, quote, restoring a balance between government and media. They suggest a new federal bureaucracy similar to the Interstate Commerce Commission, which would control all of the media in this country from the top down. Now, when they're proposing this in a report published in 1973, the John Birch Society didn't have to go much further than that to suggest to you that these people are advocating a totalitarian police state in this country, because they make it very clear in their own reports. They're also advocating an international economic monopolistic system in the framework of a world government structure, allegedly on the excuse that this will prevent a third world war. Why would the foundations, the Ford, Rockefeller, and Carnegie foundations, fund the Trilateral Commission as they have done? Well, it isn't just because that the same people belong to the foundations, hold positions in government, and also are on the boards of directors of these foundations. That is one reason, because it's a community of interest. For instance, Cyrus Vance, when he was Secretary of State, he was also a member of the Trilateral Commission and on the board of directors of the Rockefeller Foundation funding the Trilateral Commission. So there is a community of interest. That's the way it works. But there is another reason why they support such groups. The reason was given, I think, best in the context of the early 1950s investigation of the foundations. Congressman Carroll Reese, in 1953, hired a man to be research director for the committee, a man who is today a good friend of mine named Norman Dodd. Dodd was sent to New York to interview the man who was then president of the Ford Foundation. His name was Rowan Gaither, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And Norman Dodd went to Gaither's office that morning in November of 1953, sat across the desk from him, and said, all we want to know back in Congress is why you're giving Ford Motor Company profits tax-exempt through your foundation to left-wing and pro-communist groups and individuals. That's all we want to know. This was the response he received directly, and I quote, of course you know that we at the executive level here were, at one time or another, active in either the OSS, that was the CIA, the State Department, or the European Economic Administration. During those times, and without exception, we operated under directives issued by the White House, the substance of which was to the effect that we should make every effort to so alter life in the United States as to make possible a comfortable merger with the Soviet Union. We are continuing to be guided by just such directives, unquote. Now, Norman Dodd told me that when Gaither said this, he almost fell off the chair. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He responded, maintaining composure, by saying, well, if that's your goal in policy, save us the trouble and cost of this investigation in Congress. Come out and tell the people. And Rowan Gaither responded, oh, we wouldn't dream of doing that. That is the sort of admission of what's going on, the conspiracy I'm talking about, which is now contained not just in personal communication, but in the publications of the foundations and the groups they support. In order to prepare my book on this subject, I had to go and interview some of the directors of these foundations. And a few years ago, I went to New York and interviewed the man who was then president of the Rockefeller Foundation and who is now deceased, the vice president of the Carnegie Corporation of New York, Incorporated, which you know of as the Carnegie Foundation, and the director of the Office of Reports at the Ford Foundation, and the presidents of several other smaller foundations. I want to give you an idea of what I encountered there. Now, the entire interviews will be in the book in September, but here's an example of the sort of mentality I encountered. To make sure you understand this, please answer this question for me. Do all of you know who the great economist Ludwig von Mises was? If you don't know, please don't be embarrassed, because I want you to understand what I'm talking about, and I would like to explain that. Does anyone here not know who Ludwig von Mises was? Okay, please let me explain. Ludwig von Mises was probably the greatest economist in this century, advocating economic freedom, advocating an unregulated, laissez-faire capitalism, a free market economy, an economy in which the government was not regulating economic activity, and a solid, sound currency backed by gold or silver. In other words, he was probably, in the academic world, the greatest defender of economic and personal freedom. Okay, Ludwig von Mises and his predecessors and his associates came from Austria. That's why they were called in the academic world the Austrian School of Economics. Now, I think you know that since World War II, Austria has been under socialism. Does everybody know that? Austria is a socialist economy. They don't have free enterprise. So, the Austrian School of Economics refers to the fact that these people came from Austria. It has nothing to do with Austria today. When I conducted my interviews, a representative of the Austrian School of Economics, Friedrich Hayek, had just been a co-recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economics, and it was in the newspapers, on the front page. He was a member of the Austrian School of Economics. So I went to see President John Knowles at the Rockefeller Foundation, Richard Maggott at Ford, and David Robinson at Carnegie, and I said, look, I've been through your reports in recent years. I've seen that you've given money for economic policy studies to Keynesian economists, the economists who control our government, advocate deficit spending and government regulation of the economy. You've given money to Keynesian economists in universities. I've seen that you've given money to the University of Chicago and Milton Friedman, the so-called Chicago School of Economics, which, contrary to what was given to some of you when you came in this evening, Milton Friedman is a far more consistent advocate of free enterprise, but he is not entirely a consistent advocate of free enterprise because he does advocate some government intervention and involvement in the economy. And I said, you've given money to both of these economists and their groups, but I've never seen you giving any money to a representative of the Austrian School of Economics. Why is that? This was in the newspapers at the time. The answer from each of these gentlemen on 3 separate days was the same. Oh, well, I guess we don't have any programs going in Austria at the present time. That's the sort of thing I encountered. Now, I told you I would have lots of good news for you later, and it's time for that now. If I had been speaking to you 4 years ago and told you at that time that due to the initial exposure of the Trilateral Commission by the John Birch Society during the 1976 presidential campaign, due to the exposure we began of the Trilateral Commission, its power and its purposes in the administration, an exposure which later was carried by various segments of the media, other groups and organizations to millions of people around the country. If I had told you that that awareness of the goals of the Trilateral Commission would become so widespread that membership by any politician running for president in this election campaign of 1980, membership in the Trilateral Commission would become a serious political liability to the extent that membership in the Commission would be a major issue in this year's presidential primaries, would you have believed me when I read this story telling us that the membership of George Bush in the Trilateral Commission, like that of Carter and Anderson, was the crucial issue in the New Hampshire Republican primary, just as it was a major issue in the Florida Republican primary. So much so that on April 10th of this year, David Rockefeller came to Los Angeles and spoke to the World Affairs Council. His speech was reprinted in the San Antonio Register 3 days later, April 13th. He spent most of the speech to 1,000 prominent citizens of Southern California. Most of his speech was devoted to promising these people in the audience that quite truly he was not a member of, quote, a coterie of international conspirators with designs on covertly ruling the world, unquote. That was the bulk of his remarks. This indicates, ladies and gentlemen, indicates very clearly that beyond any question, we now have them on the defensive. Now, 2 years ago, something else happened after I was here, and that is the fact that on May 23rd, 1978, amazingly, the United States Supreme Court ruled in favor of a member of the John Birch Society, a plumbing contractor from Pocatello, Idaho, a man named Bill Barlow. And as a result of that ruling, all businessmen had a U.S. Supreme Court decision to back them up in demanding a valid search warrant from a representative of OSHA. That's the Occupational Surveillance and Harassment Administration. Now, when this happened, OSHA was paralyzed. They said, you know, what are we going to do? How are we going to provide the search warrants? Then they decided, what we'll do, we'll take a pad of paper, print it up, and call it an administrative warrant. We'll fill this out, rip the page off and give it to the businessman, and we can go in and conduct the inspection. Well, it hasn't worked that way, ladies and gentlemen, because like everything else, OSHA from the Department of Labor does not function directly from Washington. It goes with revenue sharing through state departments of health and safety around the country. I don't know what you call it here, but this is the way it works all over the country. Now, it's interesting that the State Department of Health and Safety statutes are often more punitive in their punishments for violations than even the federal statute. As a result of that technicality, there have been 3 federal court cases, and 1 state case in California Appeals Court last year involving a member of the John Birch Society, Melvin Salwasser. As a result of these 4 cases, now all businessmen have federal court precedents to back them up in demanding not only a valid search warrant from any federal regulatory inspector, but also valid probable cause, which means that if they do not have a prior citation they're going back to reinspect, or a previous complaint from an employee, if you demand the search warrant and the probable cause, they cannot come into the private property of your business. And thank you. Now, you should know this does not apply just to OSHA. It applies to any federal regulatory inspection on private property, in a business or a home. Therefore, it's now being applied to SEC inspections of stock brokerage firms. It's being applied to FDA inspections of drug and vitamin manufacturers. And ladies and gentlemen, some of us took it upon ourselves this year actually to apply it to a very famous invasion of privacy that is called the United States Census Bureau. Now, I should say, I'm very rarely surprised when I get something in the mail that is unusual, that, causes me to pause for a few moments, but this one did. I got this in the mail a few weeks ago, and it's a piece of literature from an organization asking for money so they can run full-page ads in big newspapers because they're terribly concerned about something. The group is called the Committee to Save OSHA. It's headed up by such worthies as UAW President Douglas Fraser, people like this, and they're saying that they're very concerned because in Congress at the present time, OSHA is literally at death's door and about to go out of existence. Now, I think you know that one of the longest-running federal harassment bureaucracies in this country, going back to the Wilson administration, one of the original plans of Marxist conspirator Edward Mandel House, was the Federal Trade Commission. And the Federal Trade Commission is having a tough time today staying alive because the Congress, in the last 30 days or so, has let it go without any funding for over 48 hours. 2 entire days of starvation economically, which indicates that I think we can maintain the removal of funds from the Federal Trade Commission, as we did with the LEAA, as we did with the BATF's attempt to set up the computerized federal government gun list in early 1978, as we did with the IRS's attack on private Christian schools. We can do this to the FTC and pretty soon put it out of existence. Now, have you noticed something this year of interest? Have you noticed, ladies and gentlemen, that there are some congressmen, members of the House of Representatives, who are not going to seek re-election? Some of them are retiring from office. They've already announced this, and this is just like 2 years ago. We heard over 30 members of the House retiring from office in 1978, most of them saying that they were retiring because they couldn't take it any longer. They couldn't stand the heat they were receiving from their constituents. Well, here's an article that expressed that outrage. This was Family Weekly, May 28, 1978. It quoted one of the congressmen who retired 2 years ago, Representative Lloyd Meads of Washington State. He says, quote, "People don't write in anymore and ask you to do something. They demand that you do something. They are snarly, bitish, inconsiderate, intemperate, and demanding. They call you in the middle of the night from a bar demanding you vote a certain way. You can tell they're blasted," unquote. Well, of course, I'm sure, ladies and gentlemen, this doesn't apply to any of us, but certainly you can tell the congressmen know that this discontent is being expressed from the grassroots level. Now, who is expressing this communication of discontent at Congress? Well, of course, you know there are a lot of organizations, individuals in this country who write letters to Congress all the time. But you should know the John Birch Society is uniquely organized around the country, so we're able to do something continually that no other group has been able to do. We're organized so that when I'm at home where I live in Southern California, I'm not sitting there, and my friend Jenny Lavin, formerly of this area, is not sitting there either, writing letters to members of Congress in our area just on matters of local interest. No, we're not doing that. And our members in the capital area of New York are not deciding, well, there's a bill in Congress I like, so I'm going to vote sent right to my congressman just on that. We're organized so that we're able to do something differently. We pick the same limited number of pending bills that are up for vote in Congress that will be considered soon, major priority issues, and all members of the Birch Society get together during the same 2-week period every month, month after month, and write letters just on this limited number of pending measures. We're all writing letters on the same ones at the same time. This is how we have been able frequently, when a bad bill was coming up for vote, maybe it's coming up a week later, we only have the weekend to work on the matter, we get the word out to our chapter leaders, and ladies and gentlemen, we have often been able to generate so many hundreds of thousands of cards, letters, telegrams, and phone calls into Washington, even over a 72-hour period, that when those poor, exhausted, overworked congressmen finally drag themselves back to work on Tuesday mornings. If you go to Washington, you see they only work Tuesday through Thursday. They do not work on Monday or Friday. When they get back to work on Tuesday, they've often been unable to get into their offices because the mailbags we created over the weekends were blocking the doors. How effective has it been? Well, How do we know we write these letters? How do we know we deliver the mail? Years ago, we used to tell our members to go home after the monthly meeting and write those letters to Congress later that week. Now we know we can't trust anybody. We write the letters at the meetings. That's how we know we get the letters delivered. Now, since Carter was elected, we've really gotten behind about 47 letter-writing campaigns against domestic and foreign policy issues pending in Congress. Of the 47, we have won 27 of them, we have lost 11, and the remainder are still pending largely in our favor. That's how well it works. Now, I should tell you the other way we do this is by putting pressure on the House of Representatives directly. Now, why the House of Representatives? Because they appropriate all the money for the federal agencies. If we want to cut off a revenue-sharing program that's going to impose rationing on you or increase local taxes or state taxes in New York State, you have to abolish that federal agency that is the thrust behind the program. You can never successfully oppose it just on the state or local level. You've got to get rid of the original source of the program in Washington. So the House of Representatives, whose members, as you've noticed, most of them like to get reelected every 2 years, they're very responsive. You put pressure on them. We do this through something called TRIM. TRIM stands for Tax Reform Immediately. The goal is lower taxes through less government. Members of the Birch Society establish a TRIM committee in a district of the House of Representatives. We have 310 of them now, covering most of the districts around the country. Bircher set up a TRIM committee, but anybody can work in a TRIM committee if they agree with us about the limited goal of lower taxes and less government, which is unusually popular today. With this TRIM bulletin, we print it up in the tens or hundreds of thousands of copies every quarter, and we distribute it not just to our friends and members, but to everybody we can reach in the district, because in addition to short readable articles on federal taxes, spending controls, on the back of the bulletin you have the voting record of the member of the House of Representatives from that district, regardless of party affiliation. We list the major bills in the House the last quarter, the most expensive bills that would have increased inflation, taxes, controls on business, all of these bills. We give you the source of the information, the total cost of the bill in terms of new national debt if passed, the average cost per household, and then if the congressman voted on the bill, how did he vote? Did he vote for lower taxes and less government, or more taxes and more government? And that's it. Now, how do we distribute these to people? Well, in metropolitan areas, such as where I live, we jog around door to door on Saturday mornings getting these out. We also hire these companies, you know, that take the advertising circulars, put them in a plastic bag and hang them on doorknobs. You have that around here. Sometimes it ends up on the roof or the lawn, but it's supposed to go on the doorknob. We do that. We mail them to people. We get them out a lot of ways, and there is another expedient. Now, I have to be honest with you. What I'm about to describe began in the state of, pardon the expression, Massachusetts. It began in Massachusetts, in a civilized part of the country, but that's not where I first found out about it. It's similar to something that was done in this area, in the Schenectady area, one of your congressional districts, by your TRIM committee 2 years ago when I was speaking here. But to give you an explanation of my surprise, I was speaking in North Dakota last fall. North Dakota has one congressman for the entire state. So the North Dakota TRIM committees had gone together, and they had taken the TRIM bulletin that was current at that time, they enlarged it to a newspaper-sized version, a tabloid-sized version such as this one. This is the one from Massachusetts, but the one from North Dakota looked the same way. Notice the same copy, the first 3 pages, and the record of their congressman on the back reproduced the same way. They raised money by selling ads that appeared at the bottom of these 3 pages so that they could put this tabloid-sized TRIM bulletin in one copy of every daily newspaper that day in the state of North Dakota. Everybody who got a daily paper got this TRIM bulletin. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you that even though they did this first in Massachusetts, to an extent you did this first in Schenectady 2 years ago, I was so humiliated when I saw this underway in North Dakota. I was humiliated because here these supposedly inferior Norwegians had beaten us to the punch in Southern California. So when I got home, we had to do something about it. And here's what we did. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Santa Ana Register, the major county paper. That's why I've been quoting from it. 250,000 daily circulation. This is the fall 1979 TRIM bulletin for one of our districts. We have 3 congressional districts entirely within the county. One overlaps into LA. This is one of our congressional districts. This $4,000 ad reaching 250,000 people on that day, January 31st of this year. This was paid for by the small and medium-sized businessmen in ads at the bottom of the page. Here's the TRIM bulletin copy and the voting record. Most of these advertisers live in the district of this one congressman. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we never would have believed that we could have done this kind of thing until 3 of our members sat down for a week on the telephone and sold the ads. Then it began to snowball. And ladies and gentlemen, the response to this ad was so encouraging that by March 6th of this year, we had another $4,000 for this. This is the Los Angeles Times Orange County edition. All three of our congressmen for the Winter Trim Bulletin, Winter 1980. Notice all three of their records here, the copy of the Trim Bulletin, this ad reaching 225,000 circulation, paid for by the ads given at the bottom. Well, ladies and gentlemen, then it really began to take off. The encouragement over this ad was so tremendous, people were glad to see we were around. They didn't know about us, that within 30 days, this is very recent, April 14th, we had another $3,500 available for the same copy that had been in the LA Times to be put back in the Santa Ana Register. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's getting out of control. I don't know when this will be in Time magazine, but I would advise you to keep looking. Now, let me give you one statistic about what Trim has accomplished and what the letter writing has accomplished. Here is the statistic, very important. In 1971, we began rating all voting records quarterly of congressmen and senators in our weekly news magazine, Review of the News. And in 1971, before Trim, before the letter writing was well underway in the current manner, there were only 6 members of the House of Representatives who were that quarter voting in the conservative direction 90% of the time. As of July of last year, there were 122 members of the House voting 90% of the time that quarter for lower taxes and less government, and that wasn't even an election year. They're all John Birchers this year. Haven't you been hearing that? Okay, so probably this increase will be more dramatic this year. All we have to do is maintain it and increase it that way once more again, and do you realize what we would have done? We would have then more than the 218 simple majority vote in the House of Representatives, and we can then unfund and thereby abolish any federal agency program that's causing problems, raising taxes here, or the foundations are using to impose controls on us. It's just that simple. We're just that close to victory. Now, I never like to conclude a speech like this until I make sure that everybody in an audience this size realizes how vibrantly, how enthusiastically some of these congressmen respond to the publication and distribution of their voting records in the Trim Bulletin. Here's an example. There's a congressman in Northern California, Harold Johnson, in the Sacramento area. This is a letter he wrote to the Trim chairman 2 years ago, July 19, 1978. Please notice. He said, "The national debt is owned by the American people, and as long as the American people are willing to buy bonds and treasury notes to support their government, there is no need to pay off the national debt," unquote. That is Congressman Harold Johnson, vintage 1978. Many hundreds of thousands of Trim bulletins later, the same Congressman Johnson, early this year, February 22nd, wrote, "I can assure you of my support of any legislative effort to balance the federal budget," unquote. The congressman, you might say the congressman has had an experience on the level of a personal revelation. My congressman is Robert Badham in Orange County, and here's a letter from my congressman indicating the influence of the Trim Bulletin in Washington 2 years ago. Listen to this. He wrote to a constituent, February 23rd, 1978, "Dear Mr. Dykstra, thank you for your recent letter regarding the food stamp program. If you're referring to the Trim Bulletin account of my voting record was accurately listed," unquote. Now, I was with Mr. Dykstra the night that he wrote his letter to the congressman, which prompted this response. I saw the letter. There was no mention in the original letter of the Trim Bulletin whatsoever. See, they know where the information is coming from. Here's a letter from Congressman Jack Edwards of Alabama, April 21st, 1978, to the Trim chairman. Notice, in response to one issue of the Trim Bulletin, Congressman Edwards devoted 2.5 pages of type to explain away his votes. One sentence is most illustrative. Quote, "You obviously want me to vote no on everything except adjournment, but that's totally unreasonable," unquote. 2 years ago, I told you about a congressman in the state of Oregon, the 4th District of Oregon, Congressman Jim Weaver, the Eugene area. I assume it's still up there. Congressman Weaver at that time had a bad voting record, 80, 90% of the time for higher taxes and more government. He had expressed his displeasure with the Trim Committee by writing this letter September 13, 1976 to the Trim chairman. Notice the handwritten postscript at the bottom of the letter from the congressman to the Trim chairman. It said, "Great little bulletin, that Trim. It reminded me of a common substance found in barnyards," in the congressman's handwriting on the letter. Now, ladies and gentlemen, Congressman Weaver has had a revelation, because since this time, he is now voting 80 or 90% of the time for lower taxes and less government. He's come completely around. In fact, recently I was in Oregon prior to the deluge, and in Oregon at that time, in Grants Pass, the trim chairman had just received a large manila envelope from Congressman Weaver containing a new photograph of the congressman with a new hairpiece or toupee. A letter was attached requesting, please, that we should use this new photograph on all future trim bulletin copies. Now, ladies and gentlemen, what I'm going to tell you now, I'm not suggesting that you do this. Do you understand me? I'm just telling you about it. I thought you'd be interested, but I'm not advocating this. Okay. 1978, the congressman in Charleston, South Carolina, Mendel Davis, promised his constituents publicly that if the Senate ever ratified the treasonous Panama Canal treaties, he, as a member of the House, would never vote for the funding implementation of those treaties. 1 year later, last year, he voted for it. The trim chairman in Charleston, South Carolina, is a member of a local city council, a good friend of mine named Robert Payne. Robert looked up the action of Congressman Davis in the dictionary and found the word liar. Robert wrote a letter to the congressman pointing out what the dictionary said, and Robert added the word skunk. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we never suggest that you be discourteous or impolite to a congressman. Please note that. But Robert is one of these emotional boys from the Deep South, and sometimes he gets out of control. In response to the letter, Congressman Davis wrote back saying, "Henceforth, I will not be answering any more of your letters. I will not be communicating with you further," and the congressman had taped a quarter to the bottom of the letter. Next to the quarter was a note saying, "This quarter represents your share of my salary the last 4 years. Goodbye forever." Robert was amazed because his congressman was apparently breaking off diplomatic relations with him. So Robert took the letter to the local newspaper in Charleston. They gave it to the Associated Press. They gave it to UPI. Apparently, they gave it to NBC, CBS, and ABC because it was featured on the NBC Today program. I even have an article from a newspaper from Paris, France that covered the story. In response to international publicity over the refusal of a congressman to answer correspondence from an irate conservative constituent, Congressman Mendel Davis has subsequently announced that he probably will not be seeking re-election this year. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I believe that just in the past few minutes from these examples alone, I've proven again something to you. I've proven to you that if you want to be today no longer unnecessarily discouraged or frustrated about anything you see going on around you, if you would rather be involved in a series of programs and activities that are not only succeeding in breaking through the mass media barrier and exposing the conspiracy to millions of Americans, but also programs and activities that are exerting enough pressure from the grassroots level on the House of Representatives to reduce the size, cost, and power of the executive branch, to abolish agencies like the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration. If you want to see yourself that effective so you know specifically the legislative victories you've helped to win, you have no other realistic alternative except to become involved in at least these key activities as a member of the John Birch Society and our trim committees, and perhaps, if you're really sincere and serious about that goal for the future of individual freedom, that you have somewhat of a moral responsibility to join with us tonight. And I just want to say to this magnificent attendance once again in the capital area, I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight and letting me go on so long. Thanks so much.